Wes Huff flames YouTube atheists.
Wes Huff just set the standard for debating non-Christians, and it was an absolute bloodbath.
Wes Huff. He is the man of the hour. At least he is in my life.
Dude, Wes, hands down, without question.
What?
The best stuff I've ever seen.
Right.
Wes has successfully refuted every claim that Billy made.
And you had this boss move where you just sort of reach behind. You're like, actually,
Wes Huff. 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 Wes Huff.
If you've been anywhere near Christian apologists since Thanksgiving, you've probably been hearing about their newest golden boy, their single greatest champion since David knocked down Goliath, Canadian PhD student, Wes Huff.
Wes, very nice to meet you.
Joe, pleasure.
So I, like many people, was introduced to you because of the debate that you had with Billy Carson.
Quote unquote.
His conversation with Billy Carson shot him into the awareness stratosphere like a rocket, going from about just 15,000 YouTube subscribers to 285,000 YouTube subscribers in a little over a month. And that was before his debut on one of the biggest stages in the English-speaking world, the Joe Rogan Experience.
We had no idea what linear Elamite even said until 2021.
Well, I never even heard it until 5 seconds ago.
I know, there you go.
All due respect to Wes. He absolutely cooked on the JRE. Charming, articulate, knowledgeable, bringing facts. This good Canadian kid was doing his country proud for the first 2 hours. But that's where the wheels came off, and Huff fell into the same Christian apologetics traps that he used to bury Carson, presenting as true that which is false or speculation.
Most people barely scratch the surface of this stuff.
Right.
And it takes someone like you.
We're going to get to Huff's failures on the resurrection in just a minute, but first, we need a quick TLDR on the past 2 months and how this kid from Canada landed in this chair. And that story starts not with Wes, but with this man, Billy Carson. Carson is the founder and CEO of Forbidden Knowledge, where he promotes self-improvement prosperity through hidden wisdom from aliens and ancient texts. He wrote several books like Compendium of the Emerald Tablets and Woke Doesn't Mean Broke. He started appearing semi-regularly on TV networks like the History Channel and the Discovery Channel. He believes that extraterrestrials have been present and interfering throughout all of human history, that Atlantis was real and had technology more advanced than ours, that giants roamed the earth, that we interact with other dimensions, and so many other things. He claims to be working on alternative propulsion systems for space travel and zero-point energy devices. This is exactly the kind of stuff that Joe Rogan loves to talk about. So it's not surprising Billy appeared on the show earlier last year.
The Pope wanted to baptize the first alien. Now, that's incredible. That's an incredible statement.
If this was my Toast the Toast AM show, I would dig into Carson's claims for hours.
Came across one Bigfoot in an open field. He was about 100 yards away. Two of us shot and dropped him.
No wonder he needs a legal team. This guy may have just shot somebody for goat. Yeah. But believe it or not, today these are all incidental side quests. Unfortunately, for the purposes of today's topic only, Billy Carson and I are ostensibly on the same team, in that we both critique the historical claims of Christianity. And some of his counterpoints are not entirely without merit. But those kernels of truth are entirely lost under audacious claims that simply are not backed up with solid evidence.
Did you know that in the Sinai Bible, which predates the King James Bible, Jesus was never even crucified, guys? He lived on, got married, never got crucified. That was fabricated by the Roman Catholic Church, just like hell was added to the Bible in the 1600s.
He's twisting and misrepresenting sources just enough to make his audience convinced, rightfully assuming that most will never fact-check him. Now, my personal faith journey includes Christian leaders who used concealment and half-truths to keep me in Christianity far longer than I should have been, who lost all benefit of the doubt when I learned for myself. So I really dislike when counter-apologists do the same thing, because getting caught in these overreaches does so much damage to your credibility, as Billy will learn. Enter our story, PhD student Wes Huff, and a relatively spur-of-the-moment invitation.
How did he approach you?
Yeah, so he's friends, or I should say was friends. He was friends with Billy. They live in the same neighborhood.
But I'm here with my good man,
Billy Carson. I've known Billy personally for some years now.
Yeah.
Solid friend, great character, businessman.
He's like, I've been hearing Billy say, you know, he wants to debate, nobody will debate him for years. And so he DM'd me on Instagram and just kind of laid this out like, hey, I'm going to have Billy in my studio in 24 hours. I can tell him you're coming, can tell him who you are. I can like give him your background, but would you be willing to come? And so that's what I did. And so that's how it got set up.
The two men spoke for about an hour. You can see the whole thing unedited on Wes's channel, but here are just 3 examples where the Christian apologist calmly and with precision brought his field of Christian manuscript expertise to bear against the overly confident skeptic.
According to the Sinai Bible, Jesus wasn't crucified in that Bible. And that Bible predates the King James Version of the Bible.
When you refer to the Sinai Bible, would you be referring to Codex Sinaiticus? Like the codex that comes... Okay, I have a facsimile. So I have a photocopy that was done by the British Library of Codex Sinaiticus that I work with in my office. So I have it here. The Codex Sinaiticus in particular is just a Greek... It's a 4th century Greek manuscript. Mm-hmm. And its text of the Gospels reads almost identical to the modern Greek text that we develop translations from. So my curiosity is just simply in kind of exploring when you say that it denies the crucifixion or that the crucifixion isn't there. I mean, I can go on right now, Codex Sinaiticus, and I can look up the end of, say Matthew 27, where it has Jesus being crucified. And that's in Codex Sinaiticus.
If I'd have heard of Billy Carson's or his claims before, I too would gladly have called him out on this. But Wes pulled it off the shelf. I couldn't pull Codex Sinaiticus off the shelf. I mean, that's some serious flex.
It's one of those things where it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down.
The Sinai Bible, where was that piece
I found
discovered?
the text where I was referencing, actually, I was misquoted. I misquoted there. It's the Gospel of Barnabas.
So let's deal with that too, because I've actually worked with, there are 2 manuscripts of the Gospel of Barnabas. It is a known forgery. Never mind the fact that we don't have any evidence of it prior to the 14th century, and none in any other language other than Middle Age Italian and Spanish. But the internal content of the Gospel of Barnabas disqualifies it from being ancient. And then the fact that it's doing things like paraphrasing Dante.
Again, just ouch. This isn't jumping on Carson misspeaking. Carson's been relying on the so-called Sinai Bible and the Gospel of Barnabas for his big claims over many years. Those on the Gospel of Jesus' wife.
They discovered the book of Jesus' wife, which is at the Harvard Seminary. They claim that this is an accurate record that Jesus may have even been married.
So the Gospel of Jesus' wife is in the Harvard Library. However, the reason we know it's also not legitimate is because even though the manuscript, the papyrus that it's on, was carbon dated to the 4th century, the text was actually copied from an online version of the Gospel of Thomas in a PDF form, and the mistake on that PDF form was copied into the text that was borrowed in the phraseology of Jesus' wife.
That's fair enough. I can respect that.
When he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts straight.
Now, this conversation would likely have faded into obscurity if Carson could have just taken the L and moved along. Instead, he overreacted and started harassing his friend.
This defendant was considered to be a very close friend. And as you can see in the photos here, top left, he's at my wife's birthday party. Person was at my wedding. That's my wedding down there. But my very, very, what I thought would be my very close friends.
You freaked out. You freaked out so much that you were knocking at my client's door at 2:30 a.m. in the morning with legal papers, acting like you have the power to enforce some type of "you got served."
And, of course, he went after Wes himself.
Different parties, different organizations. One is the RCMP. That's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Through them, we were able to get connected with the VDP. the Vancouver Police Department.
Never mind that Vancouver is way over here and Wes lives in Toronto, which is way over here.
We know that the NDP, from the University of Ontario, these people that are these religious zealots, we know what they're into.
The NDP is a Canadian political party way left of the U.S. Democratic Party. Conservative Christians rarely support the NDP.
Billy Carson is attempting to sue me. Billy does not want you to see those clips and has sent me a cease and desist letter.
Now, I too have had a prominent debate opponent sending me similar cease and desist letters to remove the content. Though, like Wes, I suspect it won't go any further.
I mean, I was never worried because I'm a Canadian, and anybody who's tried to sue internationally knows that.
Good luck.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And Carson took to a live stream to address the conversation, giving Christian YouTube even more fodder.
So, Billy Carson recently hosted a 3.5-hour live stream to address his poor debate performance against Wes Huff. But instead of him redeeming himself, it became one of the most painful, self-inflicted disasters that I've ever seen.
Carson made excuses about being too sick to make his points, accused the organizers of ambushing him, cutting off his microphone, and being part of an organized cabal against him, and even using AI and deepfake technology to alter his performance. All that instead of just admitting that he had made some mistakes. If this ever happens to me, I will follow up with videos about why I'm wrong and how I will course correct in the future.
Well, the irony of this situation is if he just kind of left it, it probably wouldn't have made anywhere close to the splash that it's made. And we told him that. We said like, hey, Barbra Streisand effect is going to happen.
The Streisand effect is a phenomenon in which an attempt to suppress or hide information has the unintended consequence of publicizing the information more widely.
Yeah.
Like you're a big enough personality that if I make a video and say like, hey, I had this conversation, didn't go well for Billy, and Billy doesn't want it released, that's going to start to gain traction sooner or later.
And gain traction it did. Apologies to those who don't care about the drama, but I needed to first set the stage before we talk about Wes's claims about the resurrection to Joe Rogan. You see, during the debate with Carson, Huff was able to land some devastating blows when the topic was exactly in his lane of ancient manuscripts.
Yeah, I made something for you.
Ooh.
I make papyri facsimiles. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript.
You nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded out. This is a real nerding out of.
And with those specific death punches, Huff is building a reputation and mystique of his expertise.
I'm not an expert in many things, but the things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. And I go, oh, yeah, no.
Yeah.
This is what it is.
Yeah.
I know, like martial arts or comedy. I could give you an expert version of reality. It seems like he does not have that. You've spent a lot of time on this. This is not a casual, cursory examination of these texts and of religion. This is a long journey. And that's what's particularly exceptional and really interesting to me, because I'm always fascinated by people that have really gone down the road, like really gone down the road, because you don't meet a whole lot of them. I know a lot of Christians that can quote you some versions of the New Testament, some Psalms, but the real, the go all the way to the back, way. And that's what you've done. That's very interesting.
With Wes's deep knowledge of manuscripts, Joe Rogan is attributing to Wes perceived authority and giving him more and more deference on an expanding circle of adjacent topics beyond the primary expertise.
If you are really good at expressing yourself and really like you show confidence in your convictions, you can persuade a lot of people.
Yeah, confidence is not competency.
Yes.
And unfortunately, those things get confused a lot.
Well, it covers up for competency sometimes.
Yeah. In religion and politics and like all sorts of things, right?
And everything. It's such a complex and fascinating subject. It really is. And I think it's because of the barrier to entry is so It's so high. There's so much to learn. There's so much to dig that most people barely scratch the surface of this stuff.
Right.
And it takes someone like you to really kind of, because it's like real easy to lean into the fun stuff. It's real easy to lean into the Anunnaki stuff but the actual real shit that we know is 100% the accounts of people that lived back then.
Do you hear this, Wes? Joe, and presumably his audience, are looking to someone like you to be their surrogate into the scholarship. Because you are so good in some areas, Joe's accepting everything you say at face value and relatively uncritically.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Now, there are other experts in the field. For example, friend of this channel and also friend of Wes, Dr. Kip Davis.
I have a couple of friends who have actually worked on projects that have revealed forgeries within Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and within other ancient Christian papyri.
I found out about it very shortly after it happened directly from Wes. Wes Huff is he's a friend.
When it comes to scholarship, Kip is a grizzled veteran compared to Wes's burgeoning credentials. And Kip observed what I did and did his own 3.5-hour live stream to point out ways that Wes's claims outside of manuscript identification simply don't hold up to scholarly scrutiny.
You know, Wes is certainly a budding scholar, if not, a scholar in fact already. So now the awkward part of this is that he is also still a Christian apologist who also still engages in Christian apologetics and the sorts of tropes and maybe the sorts of informational tactics that you see from many Christian apologists when it comes to discussing the biblical text and discussing matters of history. So right off, I just want to say I think it's important to provide a critical view of what happened here, because as much as I was cheering, as much as I have been cheering Wes on in this noble endeavor to confront the misinformation of Billy Carson, I think it's also important to point out that many of the things that Wes does say in this discussion do require some critical reflection. We do need to talk about critical scholarship with regards to some of the things in this exchange.
If you want to check out Kip's critique of Wes's scholarly shortcomings in the Carson debate, beyond his handful of undeniable punches landed, I'll put a link in the description. Now, in that same spirit, I want to give Wes props for a very solid performance for the first 2 hours and 20 minutes of Rogan's show. But when the topic shifted to Jesus' resurrection, Wes simply lost all of his scholarly nuance, the kind of nuance he specifically purported to be giving.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why, experts themselves feel a lot of inadequacy, is because they study a subject and realize, like, I'm never going to get to the bottom of this hole.
Right.
So, unfortunately,
most subjects are very, very nuanced and very deep.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you're talking about ancient religion.
Yeah.
The scholarly nuance was gone, and Wes reverted to apologetics mode, even less subtle than the stuff we get from garden variety non-credentialed evangelicals, like journalist Lee Strobel or cold case detective J. Warner Wallace. Sometimes even worse. Look, I'm the first to admit that I'm an expert in nothing, except maybe pre-Disney era Star Wars. But I'm not going on mega platforms inferring that because I work for George Lucas and can correctly spell Wookiee and Kashyyyk on command, that therefore you should take what I say about Jesus more seriously. In just a few days, this interview and the resurrection clip from it have already been viewed millions of times. So with a platform this big and being the new Christian debate champion and his built-up artifice of expertise, I'm very concerned about the unnuanced proclamations he made being wrongfully elevated to the same certainty as his true but relatively banal knowledge that Codex Sinaiticus indeed contains the 4 Gospels.
And I think pretty much everyone who has some sort of base level competency in the subjects that were talked about in that conversation with Billy could too. It just happened to be me who was given the opportunity to do so.
So let's get into it.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all. Like the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of, was it the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Now, this exactly the same miracle Joe mentions is a callback to Huff claiming this earlier in the interview.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Now, Wes just so fully convinced Joe Rogan that a Dead Sea Scroll copy of Isaiah is word for word identical to the Masoretic text, to the extent where Joe is repeating the claim just a few hours later, and is very likely going to propagate this claim again in the future. But is the Dead Sea Scroll Isaiah word for word identical?
That you can see this. A lot of it's been copied word for word into the biblical text.
But what's the word for word?
In your version of...
What does Wes's Dead Sea Scroll specialist friend that he shouted out on the show have to say about this?
At a glance, at a cursory glance, when you're looking at this large manuscript full of Isaiah, it looks like it's very, very much the same as, what we have in our Bibles. So what apologists have been very guilty of doing time and time again is saying that this particular manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, this very impressive complete copy of the book of Isaiah, is virtually identical to the Masoretic text. In 1Q Isaiah A, there are over 2,600 textual variants. In fact, when the editors, Eugene Ulrich and Peter Flint, wrote their edition, one of the things that I did as a PhD student for weeks and weeks and weeks on end was I put together these collections of textual variants, and inside the edition, it's literally pages and pages and pages of variations cataloged from this particular manuscript. Now, I will say the vast majority of them have to do with just small variations, and these are not the spelling variations. That's something different. That's what we call orthography. This is actual, shifts within the text, but they're very, very small sorts of things. The way that you would mark a preposition, whether you attach it to the word or keep it separate, the same with like pronouns, whether it's suffix to the end of the word or separate, those sorts of things. But there are certainly a number of quite interesting, I would say, relatively significant differences within this 2,600 textual variants.
So, Wes, can a document with 2,600 non-spelling variations honestly be said to be word for word identical? Out of the 50,000 words or so, that would still make the scroll 95% identical.
If you just imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later, pretty bananas.
You could have said 95% identical and made roughly the same point. But you pushed it to the false claim of 100% identical. And now Joe and his audience of millions thinks we have a word-for-word 100% miracle. This is the same kind of overstatement that Carson was criticized for. But so far, I've heard no Christian call Wes out for.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself. And then he predicts his own death and resurrection.
I'm going to try not to bring this up too often, but throwing out there, Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection is what you say in apologist mode. When a scholar says this, even if they're full-on resurrection-believing Christians, they will say, according to the Gospels, Jesus predicted his death. Or, if the Bible is correct, Jesus predicted his death. There's simply not enough scholarly agreement that Jesus spoke any of the words in the Gospels to go around in your scholarly capacity to declare any predictions to be historical without some qualification. You know, a longtime scholar of history, more by how many caveats they put in front of a claim than by how confidently they make a claim.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room.
If the Gospels are correct.
To completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected.
This is phrased slightly ambiguously, but if the implication is that they're saying they saw Jesus resurrected is itself just a claim, then I agree. There is a claim that the Gospels said they saw Jesus. I think only one disciple did this, but that's another discussion for another day.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived. He objectively died.
I will grant these things. Some would not, but carry on.
And then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
There is a claim that they claimed this.
But it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
Some good notes here from Joe. Probably the most relevant is that there was an oral tradition about Jesus for decades before the first Gospels were written down.
And if a miracle did take place and you were there, you don't have a camera, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a pen, you can't write things down, maybe you can't even read. And you have this thing that happens to you.
There's literally no way of knowing to what extent legendary development was introduced into the story before it was written down. As to not entertaining the possibility, well, I'm very open to the possibility. The problem is testimonial evidence. It is always going to be more likely that a person is mistaken or that a person is lying than that they have correctly attributed something as a miracle. I'm open to a resurrection, but it will take more than testimony.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on.
I've yet to be shown anything that defies a naturalistic explanation. But again, I'm open to it. I will accept something beyond matter as soon as it has been sufficiently demonstrated. That is not the same as having blinders.
And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.
The only firsthand eyewitness account we have is from Paul. And unless you adopt dates radically earlier than general scholarship, Paul was definitely dead before the Gospels were written. Peter was also dead before the Gospels were written. Yes, there probably were some individual humans who set their eyes on pre-crucifixion Jesus who were also alive when Mark was written. But most would put that time span as a 40-year gap. They were either kids on one end or pretty old for first century on the other end. Was anyone who saw anything meaningful still alive? Maybe. We have no idea.
And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Great question, Joe. I will never know how apologists imagine this would go. What if 100 people were going around saying, well, I never saw Jesus come back from the dead, as if all the Christians would have said, oh, okay. If you say he didn't, then I guess he didn't. For all we know, 6 of the disciples themselves were going around saying Jesus did no miracles and definitely didn't come back. Would that have actually dissuaded believers? And how would we in 2025 ever know about it? History's copied by the victors. I'm sure you've tried to correct people on something false about you. Does that actually stop everyone from believing that false thing? No, it does not.
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes repeats the number 400 here 3 times. But as you probably know, 1 Corinthians 15 claims it was 500 people all at once. 500, not 400. Now, I'm not going to fault Wes for this particular slip. I say something wrong every time I'm live. I used to be really bad at mixing up the various Jameses, so I get it. But that said, I spend a lot of time studying about the resurrection. And if you wake me up at 4 a.m., like Joe was talking about, I'm going to tell you there were 500 witnesses. And what happens when the resurrection-affirming scholar, most respected by other scholars, secular Christian alike, talks about these 500 with his scholarship hat on rather than his apologetics hat? Dale Allison?
Apologists won't like a theme that runs through this book, which is how little we know. So I come back to this again and again and again. So you take the appearance to the 500. You just ask any question and you don't know the answer. Who were these people? Were they in the south? Were they in the north? Were they in Galilee? Were they in Jerusalem? But what they saw, how many of these people knew Jesus really well? How did they see him? Really, how did they see him? 500 people, that's a lot. Now, it's got to be an approximation, but was there a receiving line? Is there a jumbotron? Some of the church fathers actually think this must have been something like Acts, a heavenly vision. So he's somewhere up in the clouds and, they can see him at once. Anyway, my point is that I don't know the answers to any of these questions. I can't name a single person who was there.
This was Wes with his apologetics hat on, not the scholarly humility he had before.
These are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said.
How would they have debunked it? If the non-Jesus seeing disciples went back to Galilee and started fishing before Jesus' body hit the ground, and then a later Jesus movement is starting up in Jerusalem, what do you think they could possibly do or say, even if so inclined? You can't be a witness to a non-resurrection. And that's not even touching all the legitimate historians who interpret these texts as beginning with a spiritual resurrection that then later morphed into the more physical version we know.
Because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible?
Joe cuts him off, so we don't know what Wes's point was going to be, but Jesus' ministry itself was rather unspecial. The only thing that makes the Jesus movement special is that it survived its central figure.
I used to have a joke in my act that a cult is fake and it's made by one guy. That guy invented it. In a religion, that guy's dead.
There might be something to that.
Ouch. Joe from earlier in the show.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And
Pretty
we know
brutal.
that and we know that they did their job well.
Well, I like to pragmatically acknowledge that if Jesus lived, it's pretty mundane to say he died.
Crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Peter got crucified upside down, you say? What is the source for that, Wes? Why, it's the Acts of Peter, an apocryphal text dated to well over 100 years after Peter died. Do you affirm the Acts of Peter is legitimate elsewhere in the interview?
Because we have a lot of books flying around with the names of John and Peter on them. So you have the Acts of Peter, and you have the Revelation of Peter, and you have the Gospels of Peter, and you have... So how do we do our due diligence to try to tie this back? So there's 2 letters of Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter in the New Testament. And the early Christians are like, we got to make sure we can tie these to Peter.
You seem to affirm it has not from Peter. How can you become famous for pointing out that Billy Carson was drawing information from the Gospel of Barnabas forgery and then turn around and answer Joe Rogan's question with an answer from the Acts of Peter forgery?
Why was it? Because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him, or what was he? What didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say we're going to crucify you, and he says it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord, and they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh Jesus! Shut your mouth, buddy.
That's all from the Acts of Peter forgery. You at least put in a "so the story is" as a vague caveat, but you're still doing the same thing Billy Carson was doing. Even an apologist like Sean McDowell has a much better response to this when asked about Peter's death in his role as a scholar who wrote a celebrated book on the fate of the apostles.
I missed something, Nahoa. I can't believe I missed this. It seems so obvious. Is shortly after my dissertation came out, Larry Hurtado edited a book on Peter. And he said, one thing we know about crucifixion is that crucifixion victims were stripped bare to utterly shame and humiliate them. Yet John 21, the debated passage where it says his hands would be spread out, I took that as referring to crucifixion. It also says he would be clothed by another. But that's not how somebody would die of crucifixion, being clothed. So that tells me he, I think almost certainly historically speaking, died as a martyr, but probably not crucified, let alone crucified upside down.
Are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
Once again, I think this pitch is more apologetics harmonization than scholarship. As Wes said, in Jewish reckoning, any part of a day can be counted as a full day. Using this system, Friday evening, Jesus' crucifixion and burial, Saturday, the Sabbath, and early Sunday morning, the resurrection, are generally interpreted as 3 days. However, this explanation is at odds with Matthew 12:40, where Jesus refers to 3 days and 3 nights, a phrase that seems to demand a literal 72-hour period. The Roman system views days as complete 24-hour periods, making the Friday to Sunday timeline even more problematic. From Friday evening to early Sunday morning spans only about 36 to 40 hours, well short of 3 full days and nights. The Synoptic Gospels all describe Jesus rising on the 3rd day, but with notable differences in phrasing. Mark 8:31 refers to rising after 3 days, suggesting a longer period. As I mentioned, Matthew 12:40 explicitly mentions 3 days and 3 nights, contradicting the inclusive reckoning typically applied. Luke 24:21 records the disciples lamenting on Sunday, "It is now the 3rd day since these things happened," suggesting a literal reading of days that does not fit neatly with the Friday to Sunday tradition. John just makes things worse. In John 19:14, Jesus is crucified on the day of preparation for the Passover, which would imply a Thursday crucifixion, while still keeping the discovery of the empty tomb on a Sunday, the first day of the week, according to John 20, verse 1. Now, most scholars choose to accept that John just really wants to parallel Jesus with the Passover lamb. So he's recording theological reality over chronological reality. Or alternatively, that the synoptics really want a 3-day fulfillment of scriptural motifs. So they're recording theology over chronological reality. Either way, neither Jewish nor Roman timekeeping fully resolves the discrepancies without making even further assumptions and leaps.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes this.
Yeah.
And I got Joe Rogan thinking it's 400, not 500.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James.
Paul, yes. He's our only written source in all of history who says in first person that they saw a risen Jesus of some form or another. I presume Wes is including Peter, Jude, and James because there are Bible books associated with those names. But surely Wes is aware that none of the authors of those letters, within those letters, say that they saw a resurrected Jesus. I don't even need to appeal to the high degree of doubt that those books were written by those men. The letters don't claim resurrection witness at all.
And Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus.
Attributed to direct disciples or not, the first and fourth Gospels do not use first-hand perspective at all, let alone for witnessing Jesus. It's not impossible that they wrote books about their own experiences entirely in third-hand perspective.
George likes spicy chicken.
What's that?
I like spicy chicken.
No. You said George likes spicy chicken.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did. You said George likes spicy chicken.
You're turning into Jimmy.
George is getting upset.
But that's not what you'd expect, and isn't remotely definitive. The author of Matthew doesn't even use first person when describing the time Jesus met Matthew.
Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness.
Correct. And Mark was written first, with Luke and Matthew borrowing from it extensively. The author everyone borrowed from was not an eyewitness. To answer Joe's question in a scholarly way, there is only one account directly attributable to someone as a witness, just Paul.
The words that Luke uses at the beginning of his gospel, where he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses and I'm writing up an orderly account. And so he's saying, I'm going to use these methods that are expected as good history of my day. I'm not an eyewitness, so I'm going to try to find the people who are eyewitnesses.
Not really. The first verses of Luke read, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. This doesn't say the author sought out eyewitnesses. This says that the entire community received stories from people claiming to be eyewitnesses. From this passage, there's no reason at all to assume that the author met any of them. That's just wishful speculation.
So we have an account of the resurrection. Do we have an account of the denial of the resurrection? Is there an historical record of him just dying and this like a refutal or a rebuttal rather to what they're saying?
It's possible that such a thing could have been written. So great question. If we had such a document, that would be a big deal. But, of course, the absence of such a document is ultimately unsurprising, as the only reason we have any of the texts at all is because Christians chose to copy them like crazy.
The Christians were less discerning in their proliferation of written documents. So the Jews had this whole system where you had to be a trained scribe, and they were very, very careful with the procedures that you went through. Whereas the Christians were like, we want to get this thing out as fast as we can, as often as we can.
And those busy scribes likely wouldn't have spent resources copying a detrimental document. To be clear, I very much doubt a resurrection denial document was written, because again, what would that look like? I did not see Jesus rise from the dead. Signed, Bartholomew. How many of us wrote documents saying, I didn't see O.J. Simpson murder anyone? Few, because that's negative testimony. Negative testimony doesn't and shouldn't convince anyone. Even if they had the body of Jesus, After a few days, that thing is unrecognizable. No believing Christian is going to see a random 20-year-old corpse and say, oh, that's Jesus, all right. Guess I'm wrong.
No, the only ones from the ancient world that deny his resurrection are groups that come on afterwards that sometimes are described as Gnostics, and they're not necessarily just denying it for the reasons we might think they were. They're denying it because they have incorporated ideas of pagan philosophy where they believe that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. So if Jesus was crucified, let me back up. If Jesus is God, he cannot have a physical body. So they deny that he actually had a physicality to him.
Exactly. This is a culture that by and large was accepting of the spiritual realm and clearly accepted information from dreams and visions to be evidentiarily on par with anything they saw with their eyes. What convinces a first century person of a resurrection is entirely different than what would convince a modern person.
So we don't actually get like a concrete denial of his resurrection in that way until you get things like the Gospel of Barnabas in the Middle Ages, which is it's actually the document that Billy brought up to me in the conversation we had, is the evidence that Jesus was never crucified.
Well, you've got the Quran, written in the 7th century, that denies Jesus was crucified. So that's many centuries before the Gospel of Barnabas.
In the ancient world, nobody really had that big of a problem with these kind of supernatural claims.
Not much evidence would have been needed to convince a first century person because they didn't have a naturalistic philosophy.
The ancient world didn't really have a problem with supernatural events. There is an ancient writer who mocks Christianity, and he particularly mocks Christianity in saying that, of course, Jesus did miracles because Jesus had a childhood in Egypt. And he goes, all of those Egyptians are magicians anyways, so he just learned the magic when he was a child.
Wes is referring to Celsus, a late 2nd century Greek philosopher, in his book The True Word, or On the True Doctrine.
So he actually confirms, incidentally, two things: that the narrative in the Gospels where it says that the Holy Family fled to Egypt during the reign of Herod, he corroborates that he actually thinks that happened and that Jesus did miracles. He just attributes the miracles to Jesus being a traveling magician anyways. And
this was written around 175 AD. So the Gospels had been around about 100 years at this point. So Celsus could no more affirm that Jesus went to Egypt and performed miracles than James Gunn's new Superman film can affirm the 1930s comic depicting Clark Kent as leaping tall buildings in a single bound. That Celsus is accepting these points for the sake of his critique tells us nothing at all about their historicity.
You know, anybody who lived in Egypt knows some magic.
That is what's really fascinating, that the mindset of the people that lived back then was that whatever was going on in Egypt was so crazy that they had to be magicians.
You did get Joe excited about one of his favorite topics, so that was a good strategy.
Yeah, but everybody believed in supernatural events. Like, there's no such thing as like a secular work in the ancient world. Even Plutarch, who's one of the most famous biographers in the ancient world, he wrote 90 biographies, of which 60 still survive today. He was a priest of Apollo. So, like, he's already assuming that the gods exist, that crazy things are going to happen in the world. And so they didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening.
Exactly. And historians are able to read the mundane claims made by Plutarch as of reasonable probability, and also the places in the same books where there are oracles, portents, nymphs, prophetic dreams, interference from gods, and men becoming actual gods. Those claims can be considered of low probability or straight non-historical. Historians do this for Plutarch, so there's no double standard at all when historians treat the Gospels the same way. Documents in the day felt free to mix reliable information with unreliable information. That's why no amount of demonstrating plausible name distribution should make me accept water turning to wine.
Well, that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about, because they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true.
Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Because like you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
Right.
Well, there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah.
Well said, Joe. The special pleading fallacy occurs when someone applies standards, principles, or rules to others while exempting themselves or their argument without providing a valid justification for the exemption. I think you're right in suspecting that Christians are special pleading the miracles of Jesus.
The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature. Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life.
It's a bit of a stretch to call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John independent testimony when about 90% of Mark is found in Matthew and 65% of Mark is in Luke. And there's a surging opinion in the scholarship that the author of John also had access to Mark. It seems these books were more crafted and changed in response to each other. That's not exactly independent.
The problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
I'll grant that the books each have some unique details, but can we call these editions independent testimony? I guess I'll leave that judgment for you, the viewer.
What is the interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers at the time? Like, what did they think he was or who he was?
He was a crucified traveling rabbi.
Hey, that's what I think too. Look at me, aligning with first century opinion.
You know, you have a number of these individuals, Cassio or Suetonius, but what they're doing mostly is describing what the followers of Christianity are saying about him. So you do have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt in that they're not saying things that they believe happened. They're talking about things that Christians believe happened.
That's exactly the point I would have made, and you made it very well. And this was pretty much the end of the resurrection section of the discussion, so it's probably best if I leave it here on this point of agreement. Now, lest you think I'm creating some kind of artificial or arbitrary delineation between Scholar Wes and Apologist Wes, know that this seems to be his own chosen double life.
Tell everybody how to find you, how to find all of the different... You have 2 different YouTube channels. You have your own, and you have this new one, Apologetics Canada.
Yeah, so I work for a national not-for-profit. wesleyhuff.com is my website. apologeticscanada.com is where, if you want to see where I'm speaking or what we're up to. I'm part of a team that does a lot of this stuff.
In the end, both my praise and advice for Wes, not that he needs any from me, would mirror that of his friend Kip.
First of all, well done. I mean, for the most part, in calling out a grifter like Billy Carson on his bullshit. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
It was a delight to watch someone who's got training take on a pseudo historian like that, because it gets frustrating to see the ways in which history and literature and scholarship are manipulated to these sorts of ends. But I think on that point as well, I hope you hear my critique of some of your response here, and I hope you take it to heart. I think you, at a minimum, I think you could have done better to provide some added nuance in a few places.
If you'd ever be open to a friendly conversation about the resurrection or gospel authorship or any of those kind of topics, I think that would be amazing.
Have you ever had a debate with a snarky atheist?
Yeah,
I think that would be
like
fun.
like a formal debate.
No, not even a formal debate. I think it would be a fascinating conversation.
Well, I guess I was thinking more of an informal conversation type of thing, not a debate per se.
I am not obligated to agree to every debate challenge that comes across my desk, especially right now amidst the craziness that's currently taking place in my life. And I'm not running scared of you because I say no to your debate offer.
Yeah, man, that's totally fair. I figured, which is why I just put my thoughts here in video form. but I did want to extend the offer in case you ever think a conversation would be useful or fun.
If I turn you down for a debate, it could be because I would want to do the due diligence to respect your position enough to actually put in the work to properly interact with you. I could be saying no to you right now because I don't put Billy Carson and you in the same category.
Well, that's very kind. And I guess no one should expect a Paulogia Huff debate in the near future. Not that anyone wants that. But if you're looking for more of this former Christian, taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the video on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.